The first time I heard about Grand Seiko, I was in a bar with a friend who I knew to be a massive watch fan, and I asked him what watch he had on his wrist. He beamed and proudly showed me a watch I'd never recalled seeing before. "It's a Grand Seiko," he announced, clearly delighted that I'd asked. "This one's a high beat." "A Seiko?" I replied. The bar we were in was pretty loud, and I was a little surprised by his reaction given what he'd just said. To me, it was incongruous, so that made me ever more curious. I'd heard of Seiko before. They make so many watches, but not Grand Seiko. Perhaps there was an element of watch snobbery on my part combined with ignorance. No, he explained, repeating that it was a Grand Seiko. It's their high-end watch brand. I suspect it'll soon become a separate brand altogether. Technically brilliant. This one beats at 36,000 times an hour. He waxed lyrical about the technology and told me about the accuracy of the Grand Seiko watches. He also told me about this movement called spring drive. This was all new to me. So I later did some research of my own. It's amazing how the Grand Seiko brand has developed over the years, and I couldn't help but be impressed by spring drive in particular, and also ever more curious. So I decided to see firsthand and went to a boutique to try several Grand Seiko watches on. I went to Grand Seiko really wanting to like them, but try as I may, I found each and every one of the watches I held and tried on disappointing in some way. I wasn't overly enthused about the case shape, nor the case thickness, and the bracelets left a lot to be desired. Most of all, I found the power reserve on the dial a complete turn-off. So whilst I recognized the beautiful dials and I had a huge appreciation for the technology encased within the Grand Seiko watches, I couldn't get sufficiently excited to make a purchase at the time. So I left it there. And then in 2019, to mark the 20th anniversary of Spring Drive, Grand Seiko brought out 4 new beauties in their Elegance collection, and in particular, the SBGY003 caught my eye. This watch was a completely different proposition from any other Grand Seiko I'd seen before. The case shape was completely different and was thinner than any other Grand Seiko I'd come across. The power reserve was no longer on the dial and had instead been moved to the rear of the watch and was visible through the sapphire crystal display. Here was a 38.5mm case size with a case thickness of 10.2mm, which I regard as pretty much a perfect size. Not to mention the sunray pattern dial, which is a thing of beauty. I just love the seeming simplicity of this watch, in spite of all the wonderful spring drive technology going on behind the scenes. Essentially, I felt that all my Grand Seiko bugbears were put to rest with the release of the SBGY003. It addresses them all. However, there is one niggle that remains with the Grand Seiko, in my humble opinion, and I want to share with you. As someone with a wrist that's just under 17 centimeters in circumference, I have an issue with the Grand Seiko strap and clasp. This watch came with a black crocodile strap, but I found it too long for my wrist, and Grand Seiko apparently don't make shorter straps, at least at the last time of my asking. The clasp is also shaped a little off for my wrist size. I suspect it would fit better on a larger wrist, so whilst I felt the case size fit beautifully for me, the strap was disappointing. I wear mine on an A. Lange & Söhne blue alligator strap, which in certain light catches and matches the sweeping blue second hand. The domed sapphire crystal occasionally catches the light in such a way that it casts an arc over the dial, which again brings a different dimension to how the dial looks, simultaneously in both light and shade. The sunray dial is wonderfully intricate, and there are times when it simply looks completely flat, and then other times where it almost looks like a fumet dial, in the way that it changes as your eye follows the line from the center of the dial to the outer edge. And if you look closer, and then closer still, the extremely fine and intricate grooves continue all the way to the center of the dial and, conversely, get deeper as you move away from the center towards the outer bezel. It really is a masterpiece. The SBGY003 was released as a limited edition. However, the good news, for anyone that's interested, is that dial aside, the SBGY007 which is also referred to as the Omiwatari, is fundamentally an identical watch, albeit with a different color dial and pattern. That watch is available in market, as is the SBGY013, which is again an identical watch to mine, except for the dial color, pattern, and the metal bracelet. For what it's worth, I have considered wearing my watch on a beads of rice type bracelet before, but again, this isn't something Grand Seiko make separately available, and I'm told that the bracelet on the SBGY013 cannot be removed. Either way, I very much regard my Grand Seiko as a strap watch, and whilst I do enjoy having the flexibility to swap out straps and bracelets, I just don't think this watch works on a bracelet. I'm someone who very much enjoys swapping and changing watch straps, and it's amazing how changing the strap or a bracelet on a watch can totally transform the look and the way a watch feels. On Instagram, I've long been referencing #MyWatchStrapJourney, and perhaps there's a future video in this somewhere. Anyway, in this video, I want to compare my SBGY003 to my Lange 1. I do appreciate that this might seem like an odd comparison. The Grand Seiko has a symmetrical dial and the Lange 1 has an asymmetrical dial. One's stainless steel, the other's white gold. Spring drive versus traditional mechanical watch. The Lange 1 has a big date function too, not to mention a power reserve on the dial, and these two watches retail at markedly different prices. So how can I possibly compare the two? Well, there is, in my opinion, a lot to be said for the size and shape of a watch case, and they're similar in that sense. Both are dress watches, but I have found that they can equally be worn in a more informal way, and mostly this is how I usually tend to wear these watches. The Lange 1 is a modern icon. I opted for the version in white gold with loomed hands. However, the hands are small and the loom tends not to glow very well in low light conditions. It will glow brilliantly for a short time if you plunge into darkness after some time charging under a bright light, but that's not reality, and either way, it's not long before the loom is nigh impossible to see in the dark. The best you can say on the loom front is that it's better than nothing. But in all honesty, I found the loom to be disappointing, to the extent that I asked myself, and also the boutique where I bought the watch, how A. Lange & Söhne, who are so precise about so much of their watchmaking, could have made such an error. I mean, if you're going to do loom, for goodness sake, make it count. And if you're not going to feature loom, don't. But don't do something half-hearted, which is frankly what has happened here. Come on, A. Lange & Söhne. The last point to make on this is that I felt sufficiently put out that I asked the Wempe boutique where I bought this watch whether Glashütte could remove the loomed hands and exchange them for blued hands, or another set of non-loomed hands, a request that was politely declined. In contrast, the Grand Seiko doesn't have any loom applied on the dial or on its hands. However, the Zaratsu polishing with its mirror finishing tends to catch any available light, even in circumstances where there is only very low lighting. The difference in the retail prices of these two watches is vast. The Lange 1 is 3 times more expensive than the Grand Seiko. They're in completely different leagues. Perhaps that's partly because the Lange 1 is white gold as opposed to stainless steel, and given the use of this precious metal, the Lange feels great on the wrist because of the extra heft. Again, and I'm being uber critical, this is personally something that I feel is missing from the Grand Seiko. I would have preferred it to be a little bit more weighty on the wrist, although I accept that many enjoy wearing a lighter watch. Had I considered this point at the time of purchase, would I have seriously considered buying the gold or perhaps one of the platinum versions of this watch which were released at the same time? No. At the time of release, I felt the SBGY003 offered the best of all worlds, and from photographs at least, I felt that the sunray pattern dial was my pick, in preference to the dials on the yellow gold and platinum versions. In fairness, I only ever got hands-on with the stainless steel version. The others were unavailable at the time. Plus, I'm not convinced that I would have been ready to spend dramatically more on my first Grand Seiko purchase. So on balance, I think I made the right choice for me. Anyway, As I say, on the wrist, the Lange 1 sits well and feels great. The thickness, or should I say thinness, of the case is something I increasingly appreciate, alongside the overall size. These days I just tend to prefer the smaller and thinner watches. For me, they're just so wearable. Again, if I'm being really critical, I think that the Grand Seiko proportionately fits my wrist ever so slightly better. It's not so much about the case size, but it's more about the lug-to-lug measurement, which is ever so slightly more extended on the Lange 1. I also love the profile of this Grand Seiko with its domed sapphire crystal, which is quite tactile. The Lange 1, by comparison, is presented in the instantly recognizable Lange case shape, which is solid and I think beautiful and distinctly German. Certainly, it's very Lange. Of course, the Lange 1 has a big date complication, which is a visually appealing feature of this timepiece, as well as being a very practical feature that I increasingly appreciate, as my eyesight isn't what it used to be. A while back, I lined up the Lange 1 side by side with a couple of other watches I own which also have big dates. In comparison, the Lange 1 easily has the biggest date function, in spite of having the smallest case size, and that emphasizes the impact of the Lange 1's big date on the dial. In order of date size, biggest date to smallest, left to right, the Lange 1 in white gold has a 38.5mm case size. Bremont Hawking in stainless steel has a 41mm case, and the Bremont Longitude in white gold has a 40mm case. Now, this is a completely mood thing and perhaps just a me thing, but I tend to wear my Grand Seiko and the other 2 or 3 hand time-only watches that I own whenever I feel like I just want to declutter my day, when complications are unwanted and the only thing that really matters is my wish to just glance at my watch and know the time. And this for me is where the simplicity of the 3-hand Grand Seiko really works. Moving the power reserve onto the rear of the Grand Seiko was the clincher for me when deciding to buy this watch. I hadn't seen this before on a Grand Seiko, and that was one of the key things that had prevented me from taking more of an interest in the past. I just felt that the Grand Seiko power reserve was ugly and in the wrong place. It disrupted the dial. Why on earth, then, does it make it okay in my mind for the power reserve to work so well on the Lange 1? Well, I'm really not sure, but it does really work on this watch, and I'm pleased and grateful that it's on the front of the dial, not hidden away at the rear. They are 2 very different watches in that sense, and the presentation of the asymmetrical dial has a symmetry that is oddly satisfying. ID Guy did a superb video offering up explanations as to why the asymmetrical dial on the Lange 1 works so well, and I've put a link to this video in the description below. The spring drive technology that powers the Grand Seiko results in a hybrid mechanical timepiece that has the accuracy of a quartz watch versus the much more traditional mechanical Lange 1. Both are beautiful, and in different ways, both represent an art form in their own way too. And both have this very analog approach to timekeeping, although the technology in this Grand Seiko is obviously in a league of its own, something that you're constantly reminded of by the smooth sweep of the second hand. There is a refinement to each of these timepieces, which in my view is hard to beat. They're both superb, but in very different ways, which makes it difficult to decide on which I prefer. Mostly for me, it's a mood thing as to which I wear on any given day, but if I had to choose between keeping one and losing the other, the Lange 1 would be the one I'd hold on to. It's just that little bit more special. So, in one sense, you can compare these 2 watches. They're both works of art, but in another sense, there really isn't a comparison to make. They both excel in quite different ways. For the money, the Grand Seiko wins hands down. I paid just under £6,800 in December 2019 for mine, and even at its second-hand market price today, I could buy 3 of these, or 3 slightly different versions of the same watch, and still have change left over when compared to the price of the Lange 1. So I see why the Omiwatari has become so popular and sought after. It's the same watch as the SBGY 003, but with a fabulous blue dial. Nevertheless, the class and sophistication of the Lange 1 is undeniable. And if I'm feeling a little bit special, or if there's a special occasion, then there's more chance that I'll be wearing the Lange 1 and indulging myself in all that it offers. It's worth saying that after acquiring my Lange 1, for a long time, it was my daily beater. As I say, whilst it's a dress watch, it's nevertheless quite versatile and can be dressed up and down. Given the way I've chosen to wear this watch, the white gold case has picked up some scratches through daily use, but the sapphire crystal is still pristine, the dial is unblemished, and there's something hugely appealing to me about the way this looks as it ages with me. Neither of these watches are likely to appeal to the showy, show-off personalities, and I feel that they're both going to appeal to the enthusiast. The Grand Seiko brand is still not universally known or recognized to those who aren't watch enthusiasts. The Seiko bit is, of course, but the Grand Seiko badge is still very much for those in the know. Given the limited production of our Lange & Söhne watches, much the same can be said for the Lange 1. These are really personal, private indulgences, and for the more discerning consumer. They are certainly not mainstream, and to someone who doesn't know about watches or isn't closely following the watch world, both will fly under the radar, and I really rather like that. A lot is said about the dials produced by Grand Seiko, and this is not without good reason. Depending on the lighting conditions, the sunburst dial can change almost chameleon-like from what you think is one thing to another completely different look. It's enchanting and understated, but extremely beautiful. In a different way, the Lange 1 is that little bit more flashy. As I say, I think the Grand Seiko is very much a strap watch, and would have said the same about the Lange 1 too, until a recent video by Watch Collecting Strategy, who put a Lange 1 on a rubber strap and called it a sports watch. I rather like this look. But regardless, for me, I don't believe either of these watches are meant to be worn on bracelets. I think it's worth just mentioning the manual wind function of both these watches. The winding experience is quite different. The Grand Seiko has a positive springy resistance to the turning effort, and that contrasts with a much more mechanical sensation from winding the Lange 1, which is accompanied by a gentle, audible grinding of the gears. I often raise the watches to my ear to listen as I wind them. It really is a pleasure to wind these watches, and far from being something that I begrudge. It actually adds to the ritual of reaching for and firing up these watches, which I don't necessarily wear on a daily basis. Winding is a lovely way of engaging with the watch, and I enjoy starting them up and setting them. For me, buying a Grand Seiko was initially about celebrating the spring drive technology. It's since become a whole lot more as my appreciation for it and the brand has grown. And in that sense, this 20th anniversary watch satisfied my Grand Seiko itch. Well, for now at least. My Lange 1 purchasing decision was predicated on my wish to own something that represented the very best that money can buy in almost every aspect. Not the loom. It is traditional, artisanal craftsmanship on the wrist of the highest quality, and the design language is unmistakable and unmistakably iconic. That's a status that Grand Seiko haven't yet attained, in my opinion, in spite of its pursuit of excellence. I think it might just be a factor of time, and I can't help but feel that the more of this particular style of watch that Grand Seiko produces, the more people will come to regard the Grand Seiko Elegance collection as being the Grand Seiko to have. I believe this collection of Grand Seiko watches will continue to blossom, and I wouldn't be surprised if in decades to come, the SBGY003 does eventually attain iconic status as the watch that initially paved the way, much like the Lange 1 did back in 1994.